Nobody can doubt the fact that America is a country of opportunity and a mixing pot of unique cultures, races, and identities. But while there are many great things that make up the United States of America, its untold history of brutal racism, legal internment and exclusion, and violence against minorities, in this case specifically the Asian American population, is not one of them. When analyzing US history, anti-Asian sentiments have persisted for decades in the form of immigration quotas, exclusion acts, hate speech, and more. The discrimination of Asian Americans has been largely suppressed and overlooked in mainstream media, resulting in failure to shed light upon the issues that many Asian Americans face today. To start off, let's talk about the history of Chinatown. Many major American cities have Chinatowns, places of lively celebration, delicious food, and cultural beauty. However, most people don't know that Chinatowns have deeply layered histories dating back to the 19th century. At the time, most Chinese immigrants were bachelors. They migrated to California in search of the highly sought-after Gold Mountain. Unfortunately, their arrival was met with hostility, as Chinese Americans were considered, quote-unquote, only slightly superior to African Americans at the time. They were treated with malice and were paid much less compared to their white workers. In the face of anti-Asian sentiment and racist attacks, they sought refuge in cultural microcosms that came to be known as Chinatowns. Many white Americans believed that these Chinese communities were infested with opium dens, unhygienic ways of living, and prostitution, further reinforcing anti-Asian racism. In fact, racial tensions between the city of Los Angeles and the Chinatown there ran high in the mid-19th century. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 had drawn many Chinese immigrants to America, who were willing to work for very low wages and in poor conditions. When white workers began looking for entry-level jobs to work on the railroad, they found that many were taken by Chinese workers. The idea of the yellow peril, that Asian immigrants and culture were an existential threat to the Western world, spread as a result. Sound familiar? The argument that immigrants take away native jobs is age-old, and it was leveled against Asian immigrants since the very beginning of their arrival. News outlets in Los Angeles began condemning Asians as inferior and immoral as a result, instilling fear that these immigrants were stealing jobs. These racial tensions came to a head when a shootout between two Chinese mutual benefit associations over a kidnapping ended up wounding a police officer and killing a civilian. Hearing of this, a mob of 500 angry Americans, 10% of the city's population, stormed Chinatown and hung nearly 24 Chinese immigrants, only one of whom was actually involved in the gunfight. This was the Chinese Massacre of 1871. While 25 mob members were indicted, only 10 stood trial, with 8 convicted of manslaughter. Their charges were overturned on a technicality, so not a single member of the mob faced jail time. Some other examples of anti-Asian sentiment directly target South Asian immigrants. Endophobia refers to the negative feelings and hatred toward Indian culture, people, and the country of India. At first, there were not as many Indian communities living in America during the late 19th century due to racial discrimination, along with the difficulty of living and traveling under British rule. Those who arrived in America looking for work and opportunity were instead greeted with hostility and discrimination as they were seen as a foreign other. They were repeatedly disrespected and referred to as Hindu even though a majority were Sikh. White men harbored even stronger negative attitudes toward Indian immigrants as time went on, as they were blamed for stealing the jobs of white men. Again, sound familiar? These racist attitudes finally resulted in the 1907 Bellingham riots, where a group of 400 to 500 white men who called themselves the horrible name of the Dot Busters invaded the homes of South Asian communities. They threw Indian people into the streets, beat them senseless, destroyed their property, and stole their valuables. By the very next day, 125 Indians fled the country out of fear for their lives, 6 were left in critical condition in hospitals, and 400 were sent to jail under protective custody. None of the white men in the mob were prosecuted for their hate crimes. Not only have Asian Americans experienced discrimination through prejudice, physical attacks, and more, but the US government has imposed legal acts that directly serve as legal discrimination against Asian American groups. The Foreign Miners Tax Act of 1850 placed a required tax of $20 per month to all foreign miners. The act was protested by English, Irish, Canadian, and German miners, so it was rewritten to exclude miners who were free white people, further targeting Asian immigrants at the time. Later, the tax was repealed and replaced with the Foreign Miners License Tax of 1852, which charged non-US miners $3 per month. The tax directly affected Asian immigrants to the US, as many of them were struggling laborers. One of the most extreme acts of anti-Asian sentiment was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was a federal law signed by President Chester Arthur that made the immigration of all Chinese laborers to America illegal. This was considered to be one of the most notable instances of legal discrimination against an entire ethnic Asian group, as Chinese immigration declined from 39,500 in 1882 to only 10 by 1887. By 1924, with the exception of certain Filipino groups, all Asian immigrants were excluded by the law, denied citizenship and naturalization, and prevented from marrying Caucasians or owning land. Further, the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1935 placed an annual quota of 50 people on Filipino migration, which excluded much of their entry as well. Next, the infamous internment of Japanese Americans during World War II was due to an official executive order signed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were forced into concentration camps due to the rising anti-Japanese sentiments after Pearl Harbor. Many of these Japanese Americans were third-generation or second-generation immigrants, having been born in the United States and having no ties to Japan. They were simply imprisoned for being of Japanese descent. The US government only began to have relaxed immigration policies in the last 50 years. The passage of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act led to a huge wave of immigrants from Asian countries, as the federal government started placing preference on skilled workers. As for more modern examples of anti-Asianism in America, the anti-Asian sentiments surrounding the coronavirus are some extreme cases. The number of hate crimes against Asian Americans in the US skyrocketed during the coronavirus pandemic, as there have been reports of harassment, xenophobic and racist language, and even physical attacks. The US president has referred to COVID-19 as the Kung Flu and the Chinese virus, and has taken no time at all to address the rising reports of racism directed towards Asian Americans. These are only a few of the many examples of racial injustice towards Asian populations in America. The slow but steady emphasis being placed on Asian American history and activism is rising by the day, and it is so important for Asian Americans to be aware of our history, to understand our roots and where we came from. It's the responsibility of all Asian Americans to advocate for justice and inclusivity in a nation where we work so hard to maintain, yet are hardly given credit for. All Americans of all racial identities should understand and be aware of the challenging experiences and exhausting history that comes with identifying as an Asian American.